When traitor becomes the word on the street, it's time to have a chat about what's really going on. Right then, let's talk about a word that gets thrown around when things go properly pear-shaped between a government and its people: traitor. Now, that's not a term you use when your bins haven't been collected on time, is it? It's a heavy one altogether. It suggests a deep, painful split, a feeling that those in charge haven't just messed up, but have actively turned their backs on the very people they're meant to serve. When citizens start calling their own government traitors, it's a massive red flag, signaling that trust has not just been dented, but possibly shattered into a million tiny pieces. It implies a betrayal so profound that it cuts to the very core of the relationship between the state and its subjects. This isn't just a bit of casual name-calling you'd hear down the pub after a few too many. No, labelling a government as traitors is serious business. It's a powerful, visceral expression of profound public dissatisfaction, often reached when people feel they've exhausted all other avenues of complaint. It means a significant chunk of the population believes their leaders have fundamentally failed them, perhaps by breaking sacred promises, callously ignoring widespread suffering, or shamelessly abusing the power entrusted to them. The use of such strong emotive language underscores the gaping chasm that has opened up, a void where dialogue and mutual respect once might have stood. It's a cry from the heart, really. So what's behind this feeling of being utterly betrayed? Well, citizens, quite reasonably, expect their government to look out for them, to protect their fundamental rights, their safety, and their collective future. When government policies or actions are perceived to actively undermine these basic expectations, the sense of being sold down the river can be overwhelming. This could manifest as severe economic hardship caused by what looks like blatant mismanagement or corruption, the shocking erosion of cherished freedoms, or even finding oneself in physical danger because of decisions made in the halls of power. It's like finding out your own guard dog has decided to rob the house. And this accusation, this raw cry of traitor, can spring from a whole host of governmental behaviours, a veritable pick and mix of awfulness. It might be a direct response to specific laws that are seen as outrageously oppressive, stamping on basic human dignity. Or perhaps it's triggered by economic policies that seem designed to make the rich even richer while the rest of us are left scrambling for crumbs. It could also be a furious reaction to rampant corruption, the brutal suppression of any dissenting voices, or even the government getting a bit too cozy with foreign powers that don't exactly have the people's best interests at heart. The common thread, you see, is the stark realization that the government is no longer playing for the home team. Now let's get a bit philosophical for a moment, but don't worry, I'll keep it simple. There's this grand idea called the social contract. Think of it as an unwritten agreement, a sort of handshake deal between the people and the government they put in charge. We, the people, agree to follow the rules, pay our taxes, and generally not run riot in the streets. Well, most of the time. We give up a little bit of our wild, untamed freedom. In return, we expect the government to do its bit, to provide certain essential things that make life vaguely tolerable and organized. This basic understanding is the very foundation of why we bother having governments at all, isn't it? So what's the government's side of this crucial bargain? Well, it's quite a list, really. They're supposed to protect our fundamental human rights. You know, things like speaking our minds without being carted off in a van. They need to ensure the safety and security of every single citizen, keeping us safe from harm, both from within the country and from outside threats. And that's not all. Oh no, they're also tasked with providing essential public services, schools for the kids, hospitals for when we're poorly, decent roads that don't swallow your car whole, and generally promoting the welfare and prosperity of the entire nation. The government is meant to be our guardian, our provider, a fair referee, always acting in the best interests of everyone, not just their mates. But what happens when a government starts to, shall we say, forget its lines in this social contract play? What if it consistently fails to uphold its end of the deal? That, my friends, is precisely when it breaches that sacred social contract. And that's where all those angry shouts of betrayal start to find their intellectual footing. If a government becomes oppressive, if it's riddled with corruption like a damp old shed full of woodworm, or if it's just grossly negligent, then it's no longer doing its job. It's not just about making a few honest mistakes, it's about a consistent pattern of behavior that shows a shocking disregard for the people's trust and the weighty responsibilities that come with holding power. And this breach, this tearing up of the unwritten rules, isn't just seen as a bit of administrative incompetence or a series of unfortunate blunders. No, it's perceived by many as a deliberate, cold-hearted abandonment of duty and a profound betrayal of the trust the people placed in them. The government is seen as having actively turned against the very citizens it is sworn to serve and protect. This can lead to all sorts of trouble, widespread civil unrest, a complete collapse of governmental legitimacy, and in the most extreme cases, people deciding they've had enough and it's time for a revolution. The whole system of the social contract relies on mutual trust and fulfilling obligations. When one side, especially the one holding all the cards, decides to cheat, the entire game is at risk. Right, let's talk about laws. Laws are supposed to be the bedrock of a fair and just society, the rules that keep everything ticking over nicely. But sometimes, and this is where it gets properly sinister, these laws can be twisted and warped. Instead of protecting the good people of the land, some laws are deliberately designed to control them, to restrict their freedoms, or even to strip away their most fundamental human rights. This is a particularly sneaky and nasty form of betrayal because it uses the very machinery of the state, the legal system itself, to inflict harm upon the populace. When the rule of law becomes a weapon of oppression, people's faith in the entire system understandably plummets, leaving them feeling exposed and targeted by their own government. Take freedom of speech, for example. It's a big one. Some governments, when they're feeling a bit insecure or just don't like being criticized, might pass these incredibly vague laws. Laws against spreading false information or insulting public officials or undermining national unity. Sounds reasonable on paper, maybe? But in practice, these laws are often just a convenient stick to beat anyone who dares to step out of line. Journalists trying to uncover uncomfortable truths, activists campaigning for change, even ordinary folk having a moan on social media can find themselves facing hefty fines, prison sentences, or worse, all for just expressing an opinion that ruffles the government's feathers. This creates a nasty chilling effect where everyone becomes too scared to speak out. Then there's the freedom to get together, to assemble, to protest. Governments can betray their people by bringing in laws that make it incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to hold public demonstrations, or even to form independent groups. We've seen this in places like Venezuela, haven't we? The government there has been accused of violently putting down protests and using all sorts of legal trickery to target opposition gatherings. When you can't gather with others to voice your concerns, when you can't collectively demand better, it makes holding power to account a monumental, if not impossible, task. It's a way of ensuring the government faces as little public heat as possible. And these sorts of laws, these betrayals written down on official paper, do more than just limit specific actions. They foster a pervasive, suffocating atmosphere of fear and intimidation throughout society. When people know that criticizing the government or joining a peaceful protest or even liking the wrong post online could lead to a knock on the door in the middle of the night, they naturally become much more cautious. This gradual erosion of civil liberties is a profound betrayal. It slowly but surely transforms active citizens, who should be participants in their own governance, into mere subjects, expected to nod along and obey without ever questioning the powers that be. Now, a government doesn't always need to send in the riot police or pass overtly tyrannical laws to betray its people. Sometimes the betrayal is quieter, more insidious, woven into the very fabric of its policies. These are the policies that systematically disadvantage huge swathes of the population, while, surprise, surprise, a select, privileged few do rather well out of them. There might not be any jackbooted thugs kicking down doors, but the damage can be just as severe. Think of an unfair tax system that lets the super-rich off lightly, or government contracts consistently going to mates of ministers. When ordinary folk see their government constantly making choices that feather the nests of the powerful and well-connected while their own struggles are ignored, that feeling of being left behind, of being utterly abandoned, starts to take root. Let's consider some examples, shall we? Economic policies are a classic. You might see governments rolling out massive tax breaks and juicy subsidies for big corporations and the wealthiest individuals, all while slashing funding for the social safety nets that protect the poorest and most vulnerable members of society. This sort of thing can lead to a massive widening of the gap between the haves and the have-nots. It sends a pretty clear message, doesn't it? That the government is more concerned with boardroom profits than with whether ordinary families can put food on the table or keep a roof over their heads. And it's not just about the money, though. That's a big part of it. Discriminatory or neglectful policies can pop up in all sorts of areas. Maybe the government consistently ignores stark warnings about environmental disasters that will disproportionately hammer poorer communities. Or perhaps it turns a blind eye to systemic discrimination against minority groups, letting prejudice fester. It could also manifest as a shocking lack of investment in essential public services like healthcare or education, but only in certain less favoured regions, effectively creating a two-tier society where your postcode determines your life chances. When a government knowingly allows widespread problems to grow because they don't directly impact the right kind of people, that's a betrayal of its fundamental duty to care for all its citizens equally. This kind of blatant favoritism, whether it's driven by a dodgy ideology, outright corruption, or just plain old indifference from out-of-touch elites, absolutely shatters the crucial idea that the government is a neutral umpire working for the common good of everyone. Instead, it starts to look like a tool that's been captured by special interests or a private club run for the benefit of a particular class. Public trust doesn't just erode in these situations, it crumbles into dust. People become cynical and conclude quite reasonably that the whole system is rigged against them, and that their government simply isn't there to serve them, but to serve an exclusive little clique from which they're firmly excluded. The rot of corruption. When greed trumps the greater good. All right, let's tackle a really ugly one, corruption. When we talk about government corruption, we mean the abuse of public office, public power, and public resources, all for grubby private gain. And this isn't always just a case of one or two bad apples spoiling the bunch. Sometimes it can become systemic, like a disease spreading through the entire body of the government, infecting institutions from top to bottom. Corruption can show its nasty face in many ways, from straightforward bribery and shameless embezzlement of public funds to more subtle, sneaky maneuvers like conflicts of interest, influence peddling, and officials suddenly acquiring unexplained wealth. It's a disgusting cancer that eats away at good governance and public trust, turning public service into a self-enrichment scheme for the morally bankrupt. And then you've got its charming cousins, nepotism and cronyism. Nepotism is when officials dish out jobs and favors to their relatives, regardless of whether they're actually qualified. Cronyism is similar, but it's about favoring your friends and political allies, making sure they get the cushy positions and the lucrative government contracts. These practices are just awful because they mean that important jobs and opportunities go to people based on who they know, not what they know. This doesn't just lead to shocking inefficiency and incompetence in public services, it also breeds deep, bitter resentment among the general public, who can clearly see that the system is rigged, that it's not a level playing field, but one tilted heavily in favor of the insiders and their chosen few. The impact of all this corruption on ordinary, hard-working citizens is direct and often devastating. Think about it. All that money that's being siphoned off by corrupt officials and their networks is money that should be going into building schools, equipping hospitals, maintaining roads, and funding social programs that help the most vulnerable. Instead, it vanishes into offshore bank accounts or pays for lavish lifestyles. This means fewer resources for essential services that everyone relies on, a poorer quality of life for the majority, and often increased hardship and suffering, particularly for those who were already struggling. The real cost of corruption is always paid by the ordinary people, especially the poorest, who depend most on public services that are either failing or simply non-existent due to theft. But here's the crucial thing. Corruption is so much more than just a financial crime, more than just figures in a ledger. It is a profound moral betrayal of the highest order. It sends a clear, unambiguous signal that those in positions of power have absolutely no respect for the people they are supposed to be serving, nor for the laws they have sworn an oath to uphold. This blatant, arrogant disregard for public trust and the common good utterly destroys people's faith in their government and its institutions. It can lead to widespread cynicism, making people apathetic and disengaged, or it can fuel righteous anger and potentially lead to serious instability as people lose all hope in the possibility of ever having honest, decent governance. Silencing the critics, the government's guide to ignoring you louder. Here's a massive telltale sign that a government might be heading down the path of betrayal when it starts actively working to silence criticism and crush any form of dissent. Now, in any reasonably healthy democracy, criticism isn't just tolerated, it's absolutely vital. It's like a regular health checkup for the government. It's how those in power are held accountable, how they're pushed to fix their mistakes and actually improve things for the people. So when a government starts trying to shut down these critical voices, when it tries to plug the people's ears and mouths, it's basically screaming, "We don't want to listen to you." And frankly, we're terrified of being challenged. This defensive, paranoid posture often masks serious wrongdoing, incompetence, or a deep-seated insecurity about its own legitimacy. And governments that go down this dark road have a whole toolkit of nasty tactics they can use to try and silence dissent. It can range from the brutally obvious, like outright censorship of newspapers and television, banning websites they don't like, and throwing journalists, activists, and bloggers in jail. But they also use more subtle, insidious forms of intimidation. As we've seen in Ireland, governments might set up systems encouraging citizens to snitch on each other, fostering a poisonous atmosphere of suspicion and fear where no one feels safe. They might also use strategic lawsuits, trumped-up tax audits, or vicious public smear campaigns to discredit, harass, and financially cripple anyone who dares to speak out against them. These actions aren't just a bit unpleasant, they represent a fundamental attack on democratic principles and the rule of law. A government that cannot stomach any form of criticism is a government that is not, and cannot be, accountable to its citizens. It is actively seeking to operate in a self-created echo chamber, surrounded only by yes-men, completely free from any uncomfortable scrutiny. This is a direct assault on the public's fundamental right to know what their government is up to, and their ability to participate meaningfully in their own governance. It's a clear, undeniable slide towards authoritarianism, where the government's word becomes absolute law and any form of dissent is dangerously reframed as disloyalty or even treason. Ultimately, the depressing aim of suppressing dissent is nearly always the same: to consolidate and maintain power, often completely regardless of the public will or the common good of the nation. By tightly controlling the flow of information, by punishing those brave enough to speak truth to power, and by promoting their own propaganda, such governments attempt to create a carefully manufactured illusion of widespread popular support. Or, failing that, they aim to cow the general population into fearful submission. This is a profound betrayal because it nakedly prioritizes the government's own political survival and the interests of the ruling elite over the fundamental rights, freedoms, and well-being of the very people they are supposed to serve, treating them like subjects to be managed, not citizens to be respected. Venezuela, a modern tale of accusations and crackdowns. Let's take a look at Venezuela, because sadly it provides a pretty stark and depressing modern example of what we've been talking about. After the contested presidential election back in July 2024, President Nicolas Maduro didn't just brush off the opposition's claims of victory. Oh no, he went much further. He actively and publicly labeled opposition members and anyone who supported them as traitors to the nation. Now, that kind of language, coming from the head of state, immediately sets an incredibly confrontational and dangerous tone. It effectively frames any political disagreement, any questioning of the official line, as an act of treachery against the state itself. This is often the first step, the verbal softening up before more aggressive actions are taken against those deemed enemies of the regime. And sure enough, the Venezuelan government's actions quickly escalated far beyond just nasty rhetoric. Maduro's regime actually vowed to eliminate opposition members who dared to question his re-election. That's a truly chilling threat, isn't it? And it predictably led to widespread protests across the country as people, understandably, reacted with outrage and fear. These protests, however, were met with an incredibly heavy-handed and brutal response from the state security forces. Reports flooded out detailing numerous deaths and staggering numbers of arrests, over 2,200 people rounded up. This demonstrates a government that is clearly willing to use lethal force and mass detentions to cling on to power, utterly betraying its most basic duty to protect its citizens' lives and their fundamental right to peaceful protest. The Venezuelan state also rolled out some pretty sophisticated and frankly terrifying mechanisms of suppression. They even set up a phone app, though thankfully it was later blocked by Google and Apple, and a dedicated military phone line, encouraging citizens to anonymously denounce opposition protesters. This initiative was chillingly dubbed Operation Tun Tun, and it involved security forces conducting door-to-door searches and making arrests, often based on these denunciations from neighbors or informants. Can you imagine the atmosphere? Such tactics create a Stasi-like climate of fear and suspicion, effectively turning citizens against each other, atomizing society, and making any form of organized resistance incredibly difficult and dangerous. The human cost of these measures has been absolutely devastating, and the chilling effect on the population is palpable. Respected human rights groups like Foro Penal reported a massive surge in arbitrary arrests, including, heartbreakingly, over 100 minors. People were often snatched from their homes in the dead of night, particularly in poorer, more vulnerable areas, based on little more than an accusation. Fear, as these groups noted, has become a potent and deliberate instrument of social control. It's no surprise that the international community, including bodies like the US State Department, expressed grave concerns about these actions. Such blatant betrayals of a government's own people inevitably lead to international isolation and condemnation, all while terrorizing the domestic population into silence. Rebuilding trust, a long road after the betrayal. So, to pull it all together, the various grim actions we've discussed, those oppressive laws that steal your rights, the discriminatory policies that pick winners and losers, the rampant, sickening corruption, the brutal suppression of any dissenting voices, and those baseless, dangerous accusations of treason. These aren't just minor policy missteps or unfortunate political gaffes. No, these are fundamental, egregious violations of basic democratic principles and a shocking abdication of a government's most core duties to its people. They represent a deep, wounding betrayal of the people's trust, a trust that is absolutely essential for any society to function well. This kind of systematic abuse of power doesn't just dent the bond between a government and its citizens, it shatters it, leaving behind a bitter legacy of cynicism, anger, and despair. And once public trust has been so comprehensively demolished, rebuilding it is an incredibly arduous, painstaking, and lengthy process. It requires so much more than a few carefully worded apologies from new faces, or a superficial changing of the guard at the top. The damage inflicted by such profound betrayal runs incredibly deep. It scars the collective psyche of a nation. Citizens become wary, deeply skeptical of any official pronouncements, and often completely disengaged from the political process, perhaps believing that their voices simply don't matter anymore, or that all politicians are inevitably cut from the same corrupt cloth, no matter how well-intentioned it might be. What then is truly necessary for any genuine attempt at reconciliation and the slow, painful rebuilding of that shattered trust? Well, it must, absolutely must, include robust and transparent mechanisms for accountability for all past abuses. This means ensuring that those individuals who betrayed the public trust, who abused their power, face real justice. It requires an unwavering commitment to radical transparency in all government operations so people can see what's being done in their name. Systemic reforms are needed to dismantle corrupt networks and to strengthen independent institutions, like the judiciary, the media, and electoral commissions that can act as effective checks on executive power. Furthermore, there must be a demonstrable, visible, and sustained return to policies that genuinely serve the public interest and rigorously protect fundamental rights for every single citizen. In conclusion, a government that repeatedly and flagrantly betrays its own people, that treats them with contempt and dishonesty, ultimately risks its own legitimacy, its stability, and the very fabric of the society it is supposed to lead. That unwritten social contract we talked about, the one based on mutual obligations, once it's torn asunder by such profound betrayals, it is exceptionally difficult, almost impossible, to truly mend. Without trust, a government can only hope to rule by brute force, or by constant manipulation and propaganda, never by the genuine consent of the governed. The road to recovery from such a state is long, steep, and arduous. demanding nothing less than a profound, transformative shift towards unwavering integrity, dedicated public service, and a renewed, passionate commitment to the well-being of all citizens, not just the privileged few at the top.